Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm gonna try this again. I did the whole thing without recording it, so now I'm recording. Okay. So I wanted to give you a quick overview of the chapter on Argentina from modern Latin America before our class next week. And I wanted to do kind of two things primarily. One is why Argentina? Like, why did we jump all the way to chapter 9 and go there? And secondly, kind of walk you through the big moments, the big ideas, I should say, from this chapter. In many ways, the structure of the chapters of all the country or region, specific chapters are identical. So once we understand this one, the others will make sense, right? Okay, so first, why Argentina? In large part, I decided to jump ahead to Argentina because I really liked the article on immigration to Buenos Aires and New York. And it really kind of crystallized for me why I think Argentina is a good place to start, right? So in many ways, you could think about Argentina as what the US could have been, like an alternative United States, or maybe thinking instead, why didn't Argentina become like the United States, right? So in many ways, we're looking at two places that became independent around the same time. The latitude of Buenos Aires is not that different from New York or other parts of New England. There could have been an Argentina that became very similar to the U.S. in many ways. So I wanted to sort of contrast that experience, right? Like the United States, Uruguay sort of struggled in its state formation, right? We think about the 13 colonies and we forget that, for many, many years, they were essentially independent countries that came together. We also tend to forget that it wasn't 13 colonies, it was 14 colonies, because Vermont remained an independent republic and then eventually decided that it would join this thing called the United States. So maybe Uruguay is, just decided never to join Argentina. And the map that I showed you here on this slide illustrates this, right? Argentina wasn't always this massive thing that it was all a Spanish colony and then it just became independent. Instead, there was really the city of Buenos Aires and a few other cities and provinces that fought for independence. They didn't necessarily get along together. And, it took a civil war in Argentina to sort of say that we are one country and we are going to be governed in this particular format. Right now, their civil war didn't involve questions of slavery, but it involved other issues that are sort of similar, right? Balance between central government and the states and all of that. The other thing about Argentina is that if you look at what eventually becomes, right, this Argentina map that you see here, really the only things that are quote unquote Argentina are the blue parts and the pink parts. All that green stuff is indigenous territory. So much like in the United States, the history of the 1800s in Argentina is what they refer to as the conquest of the desert, is pushing westward into this frontier, right? And this frontier was peopled by sort of semi-nomadic folks. And the Argentines of the time, the Argentines of the 1860s, 1880s, explicitly thought that they were doing the exact same thing the Americans were doing up north, right? And sort of looked at us and our wars that we were waging against the Comanches, against the Sioux, against the Navajo, and they did the exact same thing. So in many ways, up until late 1800s, the trajectories of the United States in many ways look a lot like what Argentina is doing. Where things start to diverge somewhat is after that, and every chapter in this book is going to have this similar structure, right? This sort of from colony to nationhood, this first century, give or take, when the country is kind of becoming itself, right? Finding out what it means to be Argentina, as opposed to the viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, right, of the River Plate. And then the next section is this economic and social change that takes place in these countries, right? The transition, right, in the world from agrarian societies, rural, right, societies, to sort of modernizing, industrializing, urbanizing societies. And Argentina went through this process as well, right? Argentina becomes urban, becomes modern, it starts to industrialize a little bit. And this is a process that's not unique to Latin America. It happened around the world, sometimes at different rates, at different times. But this is also what happened in Europe as Germany, as Italy, as France, moved from agricultural societies to urban industrial societies. It happened in Japan. It happens, in other places. And a large part of the Argentine story is immigration. And here again, this really looks like the United States. And you see that in that article about the experience of immigrants in New York and Buenos Aires. In many ways, Argentina is, one of the most sort of stereotypically immigrant nations. And so to help understand this, I think it's useful to think about the perspective of an average European immigrant in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? We understand that a lot of them came to the United States, not just, the Irish, but people from Italy, right? The Germans, the Poles, the East European Jews, and other Slavic peoples. And Europe was just emptying itself, and the population explosion that we see today in parts of Africa really look a lot like the population explosion of Europe in the 1800s, except that, in that case, people just left, and it was easier back then, to put it simply. Now, if you think about it from the perspective of a German or a Polish person who's leaving Europe for lots of reasons, economic, political persecution, wars, etc., does it really matter whether you go to Buenos Aires or New York? Either way, when you get there, you don't speak the language. You're going to have to learn a whole new language. And so all that really mattered was, where can I get to? What is the likelihood that I can make a life for myself? And so Latin American countries were, as you'll see later on, all of them trying to attract immigrants. And many of them were more likely to go to the countries that had a lot of space, right? So Argentina is sort of populating its western frontier in the same way the US populates, Oklahoma and Canada. It's like, here's land, go take it. So you find all these little German, farmers and Welsh farmers throughout the Argentine hinterland. And so this population explosion sort of emerges in Europe, and in Argentina, and Argentina becomes transformed. People have often commented that Argentina looks like a European country, not just physically, but architecturally, right, in terms of cultural character. If you walk through the streets of Buenos Aires, you feel like you're in Paris or in Barcelona or in Hamburg. I mean, it looks European. The people dress European. They don't look, Latino in that kind of way. And so how that happened in Argentina is in itself an interesting story, and contributes to that. But we'll see it happening elsewhere as well. We'll see that lots of Europeans came to Brazil, that lots of Europeans ended up in Chile, in Mexico, in all over the place. And then another part of this process of change is political change, right? If a society, and this is sort of big sort of sociological paradigm stuff, is if the economy and the social structure of a place changes radically, it's going to have political repercussions, right? And so Argentina, we're going to see in many ways the template of what we're going to see throughout Latin America, this sort of political upheaval as elites, right? The sort of post-colonial elites are being challenged from below by rural people. But this is not unique even to Latin America. This is actually part of the general European experience, right? So again, think about Europe or Asia or anywhere else in the late 1800s. I'm going to stick to Europe just because Europe is often held up as like the good path, if that makes sense. Whereas other regions of the world are often thought of as, you know, like, why can't you be more like Europe? Well, we forget that Europe got there in much the same way that Latin America eventually gets there, right? Most political scientists who define democracy, this is drilled into me in graduate school, have argued that there have been no democracies in the world until about 1900. And that's because in order to qualify as a democracy, you have to have a whole series of things, you know, with checks and balances and all that. But a big part of it is universal adult suffrage. And we know that in every country in the world, you know, Germany, England, the United States, up until the 1900s, women couldn't vote. People without property couldn't vote. And then we may have other restrictions as well, literacy requirements, etc. Argentina was no different. And as the 1900s roll around, other people, right, women, right, people who don't own property, begin pushing back and wanting to be included, and the political system has to sort of open up to accommodate for that. And it's never easy, right? It involves fits and starts. And so when we think about Latin America, we often think about populism. And in Argentina, you have sort of the stereotypical populist figure of Juan Perón, right? And his wife, Evita Perón. That populism, right, comes from the same sort of big social change that we see that in Europe produced different outcomes. Sometimes what we would resemble as populism, but oftentimes what we instead call fascism, right? I mean, how different is Mussolini, right? Or Abdel Nasser, right, with Nasserism in Egypt, or the Tokugawa shogunate and its sort of fitful transition towards what we eventually come to understand as a modern democratic system, or FDR, right? This sort of challenging established institutions, saying we need a new political and economic order that fits the 20th century, right? Or the modern world. And in Argentina, you're going to see this sort of what they call stop and go politics, right? Civilians, military, civilians, military. And this process is difficult, not just for Argentina. It was difficult for France, right? Between the late 1800s and today, France has gone through 4 individual republics. You know, a coup in the 1950s under Charles de Gaulle, right? A Vichy regime. Like, it's not easy for any place. And so that's something that unites Latin America, but I want to also argue that it kind of fits in with other parts of the world as well. One interesting thing about maybe Latin America, you know, but other countries as well beyond the region, is we could ask this question: why is the military so willing, and oftentimes very willing, to explicitly step in and take over and govern, right? Why is that possible, right? And that's something we could think about in our discussions. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about is every chapter is going to end with this sort of the contemporary scene, right? Like, what's going on now? And contemporary can mean a little bit wider of a range of time than maybe we often think about. In Argentina, I picked 3 things to think about. So starting with 2001, the economic crisis. Even though we recognize today that Argentina is, you know, wealthier than your average country in Latin America. You know, it's near the top in terms of human development and things like that. It's hard to remember how much further ahead it was than it is now. And it's because of this economic crisis in 2001 that almost completely wiped out the Argentine economy. And in reaction to that, Argentina sort of fell back on the party that is really dominant in Argentina for decades now, which is the Peronist party, right? They've never gone away. They are not quite a social democratic party, but kind of have some tendencies that way. And part of the pink tide, along with Hugo Chavez and Evo Morales in Bolivia, and you know, Cristina Bachelet in Chile, you have the election of Nestor Kirchner and his wife, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, right? German last names, immigrant country, right? And they've been in power for the most part of the last 2 decades. And so they've kind of reshaped Argentina in some interesting ways. The other interesting thing to think about, you know, some Croft students have written theses about these, are the protest movements in Argentina. In many ways, Argentina has a hyper protest culture. You know, when you think about Argentina being European, you could think about France, right, with its sort of vibrant youth activist culture, or Barcelona, you know, places like that. And the 2 big movements that sort of emerged more recently are women's movements. Argentina has a very kind of very, very radical feminist streak going through it. And I don't use that in a negative term, right? I mean like it is the kind of feminism you see in Europe, more so than the kind of like women's movements you might see in, say, Central America or someplace else, right? These are kind of very explicitly, you know, they call themselves radical, you know, feministas, things like that. And the big movement that emerged out of Argentina a couple of years ago is Ni Una Menos, right, which means not one more. And it was a specific protest that emerged in Buenos Aires to protest the killing of women by their domestic partners, right, husbands. Hi, Isa. And so I'm gonna just keep going because I don't want to start over. And so that became a huge protest that spread throughout Latin America and then beyond. And then along with it,
look at the faces.
Came a protest movement calling for abortion rights in Argentina and other countries in Latin America. And they adopted this, as you see in the picture here, green neckerchiefs that they wear sometimes the way Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts wear neckerchiefs, right? It's that kind of look, right? You then saw that spread throughout other countries as well. It was adopted by Chilean feminists, women in Mexico, and into Europe, right? When you see that iconography. But both of these movements, right, became global movements. They both came out of Argentina. The Ni Una Menos explicitly as a hashtag-based movement, the use of social media in protesting, has been really an interesting thing that people have studied about in Argentina. So yeah, that's probably more than you needed for a snapshot. And then hopefully we can pick up with your questions and comments and observations on Monday of next week when we talk about Argentina, okay? Thanks.
Let's go bring